So now let's look at some of the techniques for measuring whether or not we're meeting our own standards or those process strategies. The first one we're going to look at are job performance standards. So job performance standards are simply ways for employees to compare what they're doing versus what they know the standards to be. If someone doesn't know what performance they're measuring against, it's hard to determine whether or not you're doing a good job. So if you simply tell me, I must greet a customer when they come in, it doesn't tell me anything about how long it should take for me to do so, or even the dialogue I should have. So for me, I might determine that greeting someone within 5 minutes is perfectly acceptable. However, with a job performance standard, I might instead state as an organization that anytime a guest has to wait more than 30 seconds before being greeted at their table seems like way too long a time, then I set the job performance standard at 30 seconds to greet any guest who sat at one of your tables. So in that case, as an employee, I can then measure my own success by determining whether or not I am meeting those standards. So job performance standards help employees understand what you're trying to measure and what you're trying to manage and what you're trying to be successful at. Without those standards, they really can't meet them. In general, job performance standards should meet some key notes. The first being for employees is that they have to be something attainable. You can't expect that your employees will greet every guest who walks in the door the second they sit down. You have to give them that 30-second leeway because they might be in the middle of, say, serving another guest, or they might be in the kitchen grabbing a plate of food, or even ordering something in the service. So instead, we have to set those standards at something realistic and attainable. They also must know what those standards are. It's not a good thing to have standards and then never tell them what they are, because then they can never meet them. So it needs to be clear, it needs to be concise, and it needs to be understandable. So for example, if we have a key performance standard for our housekeepers that they must clean a room within 20 minutes, but we never tell them it's in 20 minutes, we simply tell them they keep taking too long, you take too long, you take too long, then they can never meet those standards because they don't know what they are and they're unclear. And they also have to be something that's in the control of the employee themselves. You can't give them standards that they can't control. You have to make sure that every guest that walks in the door is always smiling. Well, it's not something really controllable. What you can control, however, is that you should greet the guest with a smile. So as an employee, I can control my own behavior and my own smile, but I can't necessarily control that of a guest walking in the door. From a managerial perspective, in order to enhance job performance standards and to make sure that they're actually happening, we have to reward those behaviors that are actually meeting the standards and not reward the ones that are not. So for example, if I am doing assessments at the end of the year and giving feedback, and I give everyone the same feedback regardless of whether or not they're meeting job performance standards, then I'm telling my employees that the standards don't really matter and that they're not part of the assessment. If instead, when I see my employees are cleaning rooms within 20 minutes and I reward them and recognize them to the group and tell them how great a job they're doing, then I'm telling the group that those job performance standards are really crucial and really important. And so you need to differentiate between a good job performance standards and those who are not meeting those job performance standards. And then you're creating fairness throughout all the employees of meeting those same standards. Then each of these sections will have an advantages and disadvantages page. It will be your duty to make sure you understand these and go through these and look at them and compare them to the book. They should be pretty self-explanatory and straightforward. So moving on, we're going to look at management by walking around, otherwise known as MBWA. And so management by walking around simply states that managers are present and actively engaged with both the employees as well as the customers to make sure everything is going according to plan. This is the ultimate form of a support process. Simply, a manager is comparing those standards versus what is actually occurring so that they can fix them in the moment. The great thing about management by walking around is that if an employee or a manager notices something is not meeting standards, then that manager or the employee can fix things in the moment before the guest leaves. And as we'll find in chapter 13, our next chapter, is that this is extremely crucial for guest satisfaction, is that we fix any failures that might occur. Well, we can't fix those failures if we don't know that they occurred in the first place. So it's really important that the managers are present and doing an observation. So part of this also is that this is the least expensive technique of support process, because a manager should be highly trained in knowing what the standards are and should be able to compare and contrast whether or not those standards are being met by employees and customers alike. Fix those things. They have the authority to do so, they have the power to do so, and they have the knowledge to do so. Additionally, managers should keep records because if you don't have a record of a reoccurring problem, you might not know it exists. If you have an employee who is consistently coming 10 minutes late to their shift, but you never record that they're coming 10 minutes late, each time a new manager has that employee, they're going over the same thing over and over again rather than fixing maybe the fundamental problem. Perhaps the problem is that the employee parking lot is too far and the employee has to drop a child off at a designated time at a daycare, and by the time they park in the parking lot, they can't walk quickly enough to get to the job on time. So maybe you can reassess what time they're coming in the morning so that they can drop their child off at daycare without rushing into work, and then they're meeting the standards and you're not taking away from the standards from other employees. And you can only know this if you record consistent things that are going on. Next, we're going to look at employee assessment. This is rather than having a manager simply state whether or not the standards are being met, have the employees actually recognize whether or not they're meeting those standards. Once we have created standards for employee engagement and behavior, we can then continue to assess whether or not those are the best standards. Employees, as the ones who are performing the function of the job, are usually the ones who know the best whether or not those are good standards. If I require my housekeepers to clean an entire suite in 10 minutes, it's probably unrealistic. The housekeeper could then tell me, well, that's not really possible and here's why. And here are ways that we could maybe meet that successful standard or change the standard to be more realistic. An example of this might be that our vacuum cleaners are not working very well and we only have one per floor. And yet we have 7 housekeepers per floor, and so we're having to share vacuums and we can't get to the vacuum quickly enough, and the vacuum is not doing a very good job, so it takes us even longer to vacuum because we have to go over the same floor multiple times. So perhaps the solution in this case would be that manager would buy a new vacuum for every housekeeper that is on a shift, and that way they can clean the rooms more efficiently, more quickly, and actually get the job done based on the standards that were set. So employees are able to not only fix problems within their daily work world, they're able to fix those problems for the guest. Next is the service guarantee, and this is when the guest is actually determining whether or not you're meeting standards based on the expectations that are set ahead of time. A service guarantee is a way for the employee to know that the guest is extremely important in determining whether or not they're meeting those standards and to give a lot of attention to the guest's needs and what they're determining. So it incentivizes both the employees and the guests to recognize service and quality, to report whether or not quality was met, and hopefully fix the problem long term. So Hampton Inn was one of the first to have a satisfaction guarantee, and it was extremely successful. Now, interestingly enough, Priceline also for a while had a service guarantee of sunshine, that whatever vacation you went on, you would have great weather. Well, as we'll see in just a moment, there are actually standards for good service guarantees, and this actually doesn't meet them. So the 7 characteristics of a good service guarantee is that first, it has to be unconditional. This means that you shouldn't have to have stars aligned in a certain way in the sky and it to be a certain degree of temperature or whatever. The unconditional states that if we did not meet your expectations, it doesn't matter why we did not meet them. It simply means that if you are not satisfied with your stay, we give you your money back or whatever the guarantee is. So it has to be unconditional. It can't depend on, well, these things have to happen first in order for that to occur. The second thing is it has to be transparent. That means that everyone has to understand what it is. Whether this is advertising openly, whether it's at your front desk or in the elevator, or if you're in a restaurant, it's in a sign somewhere, in commercials, it has to be very open and honest and sincere so that people understand what it is and they're not confused. It has to be credible with a high perceived value. You can't say, our satisfaction guarantee is if you didn't like your stay, we give you $5 off your next one. Not really a big incentive to get me to participate or to report to you that I'm not happy. Instead, I probably just won't come back. The service guarantee needs to be equivalent to the problem that occurred in the first place. So if I was staying at your hotel and I had a terrible night's rest because it was really loud, there were kids running around, the air conditioning wasn't working, and I was just really not rested at all, and then you tell me, well, I'll give you $5 off next time, I'm not very satisfied. The equivalent to my bad experience would be that I probably shouldn't have to pay for my stay because I was not delivered what was promised to me, which was a good night's sleep. Next, it has to be focused on key features of the service, and this is the number one problem with that Priceline one. is that this has to be something that can be controlled by the organization and focused on what's key within the organization's offerings. So for Priceline, what they're offering is a hotel stay, an air flight, a rental car. Those products have nothing to do with weather. So they can't guarantee weather, and it's not something under their control. And that's not what they're selling you. They're not selling you good weather. They're selling you a flight, an air, a hotel room, a rental car, whatever. And so in this case, Priceline really isn't offering a service guarantee. What they're doing is offering a promotion. Okay, next, it has to be significant compensation to the customer. This goes back to credible with a high perceived value, that it has to be equivalent. So, for example, if I have a delivery guarantee that your pizza will be delivered within 20 minutes, hot and fresh, or it's free, then there has to be an actual compensation of that pizza. Whether or not I met those standards will be determined both by the employee and the organization. The organization by the 20-minute standard, and the guest by the fact that it's hot or not. Has to be easy to understand and communicate, can't be confusing, and the customer has to be able to invoke it easily. If they have to fill out all this paperwork and they have to tell 10 different managers what happened before someone's willing to give it to them, they're not going to. They're just going to vote with their feet and not come back. And part of that is the employees have to be able to invoke the satisfaction guarantee. You can't have a satisfaction guarantee that requires a manager to give it, because then what's happening is you're asking the guest to continually tell people what went wrong rather than having the employees empowered to fix the problem in the first place. And then the last way we can do this is actually just asking the guest, did we meet your standards? This can be done informally with simple things like, how was everything? Did you enjoy your stay? How was the food? Is the steak cooked correctly? And then you can get a little more formal with formal inquiries, and this could be more exact questions. Something along the lines of, was the smell in the guest room okay? Did you have a restful night? Was the bed very comfortable, right? So you can have some more formal questions, typically done by management or employees who are trained to ask very specific questions. Or you can even go a more rigorous route, and this is to have a very formal, structured guest interview. The difficulty with this is that you need an expertise and training in not only performing, but writing the questions to meet a certain standard, and that tends to be very costly. However, I do have an example for you here. A resort did a structured interview with a guest, and they recorded it and put it online just for you so you can see what exactly that looks like. And these are the techniques for looking at support processes during the actual experience a guest has, and hopefully where you can fix something in the moment rather than having to recuperate afterwards, something that we'll see in Chapter 13.